see you unless your camera is on. So there are other people, we have several other people on. I invite you to turn on your cameras and we're going to start. And I'm going to introduce Jerry Tater, who is the chair of our Israel Action Committee, and he is going to introduce our program.
Before I begin, let me ask, can Dr. Aschheim take off his mask? He's fully vaccinated, booster, everything. Does anyone have a problem with that?
No.
All right, good. So Dr. Daniel Aschheim serves now as the consul for public diplomacy at the Consul General of Israel to the Midwest. This is the position that he was elevated to after he served at the Israel Embassy in Senegal. After his service in the intelligence corps of the IDF, Dr. Aschheim worked as a director and advisor in public, private, and educational areas. And probably his most harrowing experience in life, my guess is, was he served as a concierge at the prestigious King David Hotel, where he had to meet all the requests of various celebrities, TV, movies, and United States presidents. So that if that doesn't get you ready for battling public life, I don't know what will. So with great pleasure, I welcome you to our session.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you, Rabbi Cohen, for having me. Great seeing you again. Thank you very much for being here. And I'm always very happy to see people in person, also you in Zoom, so hi to you. But it really is exciting because I came to Chicago last September into a very unique virtual reality, meeting hundreds of people from around the Midwest, but not really meeting any of them. So for me, every opportunity to meet people and see them and interact is very important on the personal level and also on the professional level. So we are a small and intimate group. So the way I think I would like to continue today, I want to give a bit of a quick 15 to 20 minutes overview of the way we see Israel sees today the relationship between the United States and Israel with Jewish communities, with the liberal progressive groups, new government, and more things that are the main things that we are dealing with. And then I'd like to open it for Q&A, anything else. And it's very important
the
for me
picture so I can chat
in advance already that I'm the diplomat here and I need to be diplomatic. You don't. And really, I'm asking you, please don't be diplomatic. Ask anything that's on your mind, anything at all. If it's the toughest question, the easiest question, personal question, whatever it is, feel free. So, if I would have done the same presentation 15 years ago, I would have sat here at Temple Jeremiah and talked to you about the Israel-US relationship. I would say everything is perfect. Our relationship has never been better. Israel and America, great friends forever. Doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. Israel will always be there. America will always be there for Israel. Of course, there were ups and downs throughout the years, administrations, but all in all, it was a very clear cut that Israel is a consensual matter in American politics between the groups and American Jews in the state of Israel. This was 15 years ago. I'm speaking to you today, and this is definitely not the reality anymore. It's true, the relationship between Israel and America are very, very strong. They'll continue to be very strong. It's the most important pillar of Israel's foreign policy is the relationship with the United States. It's a true alliance, whether in shared values, shared interest, a lot of shared common things. But, and this is a very problematic but, Israel is starting to become this hot potato that is becoming a contested issue also inside American politics. We're going to talk about it later why, but it's not so important why at this stage. It's just the fact that Israel is becoming, some people see it like it's another abortion matter, yes or no, pro-life or pro-choice, whether it's gun holding. So there's Israel in between. And this is the worst place that we can be in. We cannot allow to be in a place that Israel is this contested matter. And this is true in the general public discourse, but this is also true, unfortunately, in the discourse between Israel and the so-called diaspora Jews, or the Jews of the United States, mainly in the more liberal progressive ones. So this is also a generational matter. So I see in this room, we have, I would say, 3 generations in this room sitting, I think. And if we're looking in a generational kind of way, especially in the Jewish community, if we're looking at the older generation, those who fled mostly from Europe, felt, or there were already there were children during the Holocaust period, or their parents were leaving. It was a threat, existential threat to the Jewish race, the Jewish religion, the Jewish people. And Israel was this kind of safe haven there. We need to support, regardless what happens, the blue box of Keren Kayemet, the JNF, we put the money in and we are quiet. That was, sorry for being very generalizing and not very deep. But this was mostly the first generation. The second generation, I think most of the room here, experienced the 67 war, the 73 war, seeing this young Jewish state facing threats which were truly existential threats. Wars, armies of all the Arab countries around us coming in order to wipe Israel off the map. And against all the odds, Israel won in 67, again in 73, against all odds, Israel won. But this was also a realization point saying, okay, Israel grew, this miracle remained strong and won. But then came the third generation, which was born into a completely different reality, born into a strong Israel, independent Israel, a country that I'm putting Iran aside because Iran is the only real existential threat that Israel really has, and it really is an existential threat, talk about in a moment. But the other threats, I remember I was living through the second Intifada, horrible, horrible days, buses exploding every day by Palestinian terrorists, coffee shops, university, really horrible days, but they were not existential threats. They were truth threats on our personal existence, but not existential. And people were born into this reality that suddenly the equation changed and Israel is a strong one. And there are those who consider the Palestinians as the victims, those who consider everyone has their own thoughts, but it's not anymore the idea that it's the small country against all odds against the ones who are threatening their life. And this also caused many of the different things that we see today that led to the question that we are seeing also in many college campuses here. So a lot of I saw the beautiful young children here sitting and talking in Hebrew in their Sunday school. I don't know how much they like coming to Sunday school, but the parents like that they're there. But they are there. And they grow up in the community and they are told that Israel is something part of our heart and go on. And they go to university and colleges here in the Midwest or around the place. And they're suddenly forced by our counterparts on college that did a very, very strategic long-term job in campuses to convince that if you're liberal and progressive, you cannot be pro-Israel. And they built this false equation saying Zionism equals colonialism equals racism equals apartheid equals the existence of the state of Israel is already a sin. And then the Jewish students who are going to college are forced to choose, are you pro-Israel or are you liberal and progressive? And we say this is just invalid and it can definitely come together. And it's completely fine to have legitimate criticism on certain policies. It is not legitimate to undermine the existence of the Jewish state. And this thin line between legitimate criticism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism is often crossed and is used in different terminology. Now, this is what we are seeing in college campuses. And we are seeing it also in the relationship between the reform conservative movement and Israel based on several factors. One, those who claim, I'm speaking to hundreds of congregants and rabbis. Every place I go, I do a reform roundtables with reform conservative rabbis. We openly discuss these matters. So one, I'm usually told there's a difference in values, the way certain things are. So if you value X, if there's a feeling that Israel is doing something else. There are those who claim that it's because the official Israel doesn't recognize the reform and conservative movement, which is an issue, definitely is an issue. And there are those who claim it's because of relationship to the Palestinians and many, many different claims. A lot of them legitimate, some of them we can discuss, but in general, those are the claims. And I want to claim that these gaps are much smaller than one thinks. And this, I always give an example, is when they did public polls in Israel and asked them, the vast majority of those who consider themselves secular or Masorti, which is traditional. It's not the Masorti movement that we know. It's those who consider themselves traditional. And they asked them, what are the values that for you consider as Jewish values? What is important for you? And they stated 1, 2, 3, 4. And they asked the reform and conservative Jews in America, what are your values? It was much closer than what one thinks. They were pretty much similar. So they said the secular, so for us, it's the celebrating the holidays, it's caring about the other, it's the Hebrew, it's the language, it's the culture, history, and more. And yet, nevertheless, when you ask Israelis in Israel, the Jews, the secular Jews, so are you Reformed Jews? They'll say to you, God forbid, no. And I'm saying this as I'm saying it personally, it's saddening, but it's the truth. And I don't know, Rabbi Cohen, we had this conversation a few months ago, but this is the truth. Despite the fact that it's growing and growing, my wife converted with the Reform movement in Israel. We sat a year in Kol HaNeshama in Jerusalem, Rabbi Levi, it was a great time. But I spoke to them also clearly. I said to them, where are you in Israeli public discourse? Where are you? How can it be that the Israelis consider themselves with the same values that you do, and nevertheless they still aren't consider themselves Reform, and they are even resented. There's a resentment. And when you ask American Reforms or conservatives, so are you secular Jews? They'll say, God forbid, no. We are not. We are religious conservative, or we are practicing Reform Jews. So a lot of terminological things, and I always consider, if you want, we can talk about it later. I think it's much more a branding and marketing issue between the both sides that just think they speak the same language, even though they speak English, they speak completely parallel tracks. Terminology is different, the cultural gaps are different, the reference points are different, and everything is different. I think it could be much closer if we just know how to sell our message better. So that's regarding that. Then a lot of the times that I did the presentations with different groups, I was told, this was exactly a year ago, I was told by people, one of the reasons why we're feeling more and more disconnected to Israel is the fact that Netanyahu's government is an extreme right government, and Trump and Netanyahu were seen as the same. We are Democrats, and therefore Israel is a Republican annex. That's the claim that I heard. And they told me Netanyahu will rule for the next 20 years. And I told them, I think we should be more humble. This was a year ago. I said, I don't know. He might be ruling longer, might be elected again. He might not. The best job in the 1987 was being a Sovietologist. You said there, you have a job forever. You can talk about the Soviet Union. They had the best job. It was really, you'll never lose your job, people said. The day after they need to look for new jobs. People who sat and watched television in Germany, the end of the 80s, didn't think that the day after the wall will not be there. So I'm saying we need to also think about peace agreements. We never thought the Abraham Accords, out of the blue, we can think whatever we want about Trump, Netanyahu, doesn't matter, it's a phenomenal thing. It's a game changer. The Abraham Accords that came unfortunately in bad timing in the midst of COVID, so the tension went a bit down. But this is truly, I was with my wife in 2015, we went on our honeymoon. And we went to the Maldives, beautiful islands. In the middle, we wanted to go to somewhere even more exotic. We said we heard about this Dubai, this place like the Las Vegas of the desert. Let's go there. We had German foreign passports, so we said we can enter. But it says the first thing in the airport there, it says entrance for Israeli citizen is prohibited. Oh. Not a funnest feeling when you're going on a honeymoon. And this was before I was a diplomat, so I could still go. And we came, it was nice, but it was a very uncomfortable feeling to know that you're in a place that doesn't want you there. I'm fasting forward 5 years. Out of my 15 friends, 7 of them already visited flying with the El Al Israeli Airlines flights to Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Have friends who already did businesses with Dubai companies. Universities are opening that billions and dollars already spent in mutual deals between the country. This is truly phenomenal. And this is the first time that Israel has peace, which is a deep peace, which is not only a so-called, the peace with Egypt and Jordan was strategically much more important for the long term. There's no doubt about it. And it held throughout very difficult days, but it remains so-called a cold peace. It's still today illegal to translate a book into Hebrew in Egypt. It's illegal. And here we are seeing delegations coming, cultural exchange, community exchange, university, unbelievable. And we are seeing this is happening, this is really a game changer. So back to the conversation. So I told them, history changes, and who knows what government will come. And really a few months later, a new government emerged in Israel. And this new government in Israel, look, I don't know how long it will stay. No one thought it's going to start, no one thought it's going to be formed. Then no one thought they're going to pass a budget. And then no one knows if it's going to stay for 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, or half a year. I really don't know. Really hard to know. And nevertheless, it's phenomenal. The fact that today we have a government, first time in Israeli history, We have a prime minister coming from the religious Zionist party, who is a modern Orthodox religious Jew, together with two other right-wing ideological parties, a few centrist parties, and the ideological left parties, the two of them. The last time the two of them were in government were in 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin's coalition was there. So the Meretz and the Labor Party. We have the head of the Judicial Committee in the Knesset, who is a Reform rabbi. We have a deaf member of parliament of the coalition. We have an Ethiopian minister. And more importantly, it's the first time we have in coalition an Arab, Muslim, Islamic Brotherhood party who are heading the Interior Committee. This is unheard of. And we are talking a lot of the time, the terminology here is diversity, equity, inclusion. And we are blamed for Israel being not diverse without inclusion. And I'm saying, excuse me, this is not a soundbite or something I'm selling as marketing. This is not only showing Israeli society that has a lot of different opportunities, but this is the official elected government of Israel, which is formed by an unheard of coalition. And I think the fact that they're living together and working together is a game changer. For good, for bad, doesn't matter what's going to happen. But it's the first time, and it broke the ceiling of things that were really unimagined a year ago. And therefore, and then I came to more presentations with the same groups, and I didn't hear a change. And I asked them really sincerely, you are criticizing Israel for the Netanyahu government for years now, saying that we are feeling disconnected because Netanyahu is there. And I said, but I didn't hear anything different when the new government came. And then I figure out, I really realized that it's really much more deep than which government is in Israel or not. It's really truly the relationship between Israel and the liberal Jews in America. There are issues there. And the fact that if we don't talk about it, it will just not pass. We have to be aware of them. We have to realize that there are certain issues which are profound. And in order to overcome these challenges, we have to realize that there are challenges. And I think this government realizes that. And you could hear by statements of Prime Minister Bennett, of Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, from Diaspora Minister Nachman Shai, and more very clear statements about the importance of building bridges to our brothers and sisters in the Reform and Conservative movement. They said it clearly in their speeches. And understanding that the future of the State of Israel lies on the relationship between our fellow Jews in America. There were claims in the past, they said, okay, the Jews are disappearing, we can continue with only the Orthodox ones and the evangelical. Nonsense, really is nonsense. It's something that it's first of all not the reality. B, also even in the evangelical community, the younger ones, we are seeing similar tendencies to the younger Jews who are getting more and more liberal progressive and becoming more critical towards Israel. So I'm leaving that aside. But when we are talking about the relationship with the Jews, it's something that we have to work on day and night. And again, the fact that I'm sitting today with you, and then the next group, our younger children, is very optimistic, because a lot of times I have this conversation, the average age is 95. And not that I have a problem with that, really not. But if the only people who come on a Sunday morning or on a Saturday, whatever it is, are the older generation, we have a problem here, because there's no more discourse and communication with the younger generation. And the first interaction is already critical interaction. And they don't have enough the understanding of why, first of all, care about Israel, because they already experienced. They went to Spain for student exchange, Italy. They feel importance they have good relationship with them. Israel is another country for many of them. It's not anymore this country that we imagine, we assume that it's in their heart, and then we discuss the challenges. We shouldn't assume that anymore. I'm speaking to many young professionals, and we have this understanding and realization that it's not more taken for granted and a given that Israel is an integral part of who they are. It's not. Despite going to Sunday school, despite going to Jewish schools, it still isn't. And we have to make sure that we continue to do this discussion. It can be a hard one, it could be a nice one, it could be a less nice one, but it's important that each one of you talk about it. The indifference is what is going to make our lives much, much harder in the future. It's okay to be critical. It's okay to express the challenges and talk about them. It's not okay to put it aside and forget about it and make Israel just another place, because we need you and you need us. It's really a mutual connection. And my job also, I feel like an ambassador of the American community to Israel, telling them, you need to care more about what the American Jews have to say. But I also say to you here, you need to care about what's going in Israel. And it has to be synchronized together. It has to be coming together. We can't separate anything. We're on this boat together, if we like it and if we don't. And I think there's a lot of potential to a lot of growth and a lot of work together to overcome these challenges and find a way. So this is in general how we are seeing it now. I'll just say last word about the Midwest. So the May conflict made it very, very visible, all the things I mentioned before. We also see it in the political system. So the vast majority of the Democratic Party, including President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, are firm, true supporters of the state of Israel. They grew with that ideology. All their records were accordingly supporting Israel. Nevertheless, there are a group of a small group inside the Democratic Party, small but very, very vocal, especially in social media, who a lot of them, unfortunately, are in our region, in the Midwest, so-called the Squad, now not anymore 4, they're growing. And they are not anymore in the legitimate criticism of the state of Israel, but they are becoming more and more in the edge of undermining the existence of the state of Israel. And they're bringing a lot of public attention through their discourse, especially, as I said, in the social media. And in last May, in the conflict, we saw this erupting, and we also saw the silence of the Jewish community. And I have had exactly in the end of May, I was called to go to Skokie to a group of young, very promising Jewish progressive leaders in workplaces. So one from Google, one from Amazon, really one is in a school teacher, public school. They told me, we are afraid that we'll lose our jobs. We have a BLM sign in our door. We also had a pro-Israel sign. And when people knew about it in our workplace, we were told we have to take it away. And if we are seen as supportive of Israel, we are marginalized in our workplaces. Real fear. They asked not to be quoted with their names, and I respected that, but it was really troublesome. And I kept on having this conversation with different liberal groups, and I heard similar things, and they told me the fact that the Jewish federations did not show clear support of Israel during when Israel was attacked was something that undermined us. And this is something I told our friends at the JUF in Chicago, in Detroit, in Minnesota. And this was not by accident. This was not by chance. This happened. This did not happen in previous operations. It's the first time that it happened when Israel was under attack. And I always say it's fine to have the discussions about 2-state, 3, whatever you want. It can be the day after. And not during the fact that all my family was running to shelter for 2 weeks and people were killed and forced to go really underground. And the silence was caused because what I heard from them, I asked them why was it, and they said, look, what I said in the beginning, Israel became a hot potato in the Jewish community. We know that if we do a statement now, this I was told not in Chicago, but in a different, very prominent federation, that if there's a statement that we're not certain that 70% of our donors will support, we are silent. Or we move it maybe to the JCRs. And this is a very important thing to say that these are becoming things that are not conflicted or not challenging before, became such things. So when Israel is attacked from Gaza, it became a controversial matter. It used to not be controversial. And this is also becoming. So there are no more sacred things in the discussion. And this is something that we really need to be open about. It's not a fun thing, but we have to talk about it. So that's the way we see it, we view it now. It's on the one hand, it sounds bad. On the other hand, I'm very optimistic. I see the people that I'm meeting very, very passionate, very, very keen, and very, very knowledgeable, a lot of them. They have the passion, they have the drive. And I think with real interactions, the sky's the limit to what we can achieve together. So on the positive note. So I'm opening it up for you. Whatever your thought, you can disagree with everything I said, you can agree, you can ask questions. It could be about anything that I said or didn't say, or really any topic that you're interested in hearing. But what we do also in the consulate, if you're interested. Please, just tell me your name and what you do.
Alan, and I'm a congregant here. I'm retired. Can you address the distaste that the Israeli government and the Israeli people have for Reform Jews both in Israel and in the United States?
Yeah, so I'll say thank you for the question. So I don't think it's in the Israeli government. As I mentioned, it's different in this specific government, as we have the prime minister, foreign minister, and diaspora minister very clearly saying we want to make this connection a stronger one, and they have actions connected to that. And we have a reform rabbi who is the head of the judicial committee. So I'm separating between the government that really understands the complexity and what they are, and they know they visited. Nachman Shai, the minister of diaspora, was touring the synagogues and communities, and they hosted the reform movement in Jerusalem. So I'm separating between the government and the people. And this is something this is from what I'm feeling. It's not something I have a sound bite or talking points about. This is what I'm feeling open here to talk about it. But this is what I'm feeling. And you can disagree. I think, and this I told my friends in the Reform Synagogue in Jerusalem, the fact that the Reform movement in Israel chose their flagship struggle. When you ask an Israeli today if they know anything about the Reform movement, they'll say, yes, it's a few women in the wall. There's something there with the wall. That's basically it. No, there's no deep understanding, not of the roots, not of the history, just that that's how it is. They don't know it because it's not present in the space in Israel. It is, but very small numbers. We're talking less than 100,000 people out of 9 million who consider themselves officially Reform, practicing Reform. And let's talk about the women of the wall for a second. And I'm not giving my own personal opinion. Yes, no, doesn't matter. It's really not relevant, my personal opinion. And it doesn't matter how courageous they are and how good their job they did, because they really brought it into public attention. So they did a good PR job looking at that. It's always on the news. If you read Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, or Haaretz, there won't be a month without something mentioning the women of the wall. On the other hand, if you read the Israeli press in Hebrew, you'll see it mentioned when there are clashes, physical clashes in the wall, and that's the only time you hear about it. And the truth is that for the vast majority of Israelis, it's a non-matter. It's really non-matter. It's not a matter in gender equality. It's not a matter. It's just, there's the Western wall. People go there. You go in your bar mitzvah. You go after to pray sometimes. Fine, let them do it. Let the women pray there. They don't understand the essence behind this. And they say, what do they want now? And this is a lot, I'm hearing it from my friends. It's not something I'm talking about. It's not official. And I think the fact that this is the only thing that is known to the general Israeli public out of so many beautiful things, and this could also be a beautiful thing. I'm not saying it's not, but and there are so many things that the Reform movement is promoting. And there's so many things that they could have promoted connected to secular Judaism, whether it's, and they do it, but they don't show it as much, whether it's connected to civil marriage, whether it's connected to minorities, whether it's connected to public transportation on Shabbat, I don't know, cultural Judaism, showing the positive aspect. There are many, many different things that they actually do very nicely, but the emphasis on PR there is less successful. And I think really what I said before, it's much more connected on the way I see it, on terminology, marketing, and branding. Because if Israelis would have understand what the Reform movement is, many people could have identified and joined cultural activities there. And you see more and more on the slight levels going to bar mitzvahs and are joining Ma'agalei Chaim, the circle of life, through the Reform movement. My school in Jerusalem became a Tali school, which is affiliated somehow to the Reform movement. It was a public school. So we got a bit more of that, but it was never called the Reform movement, or Tnu'a Liyadut Mitkademet, as they call it in Israel. But yes, I think it's connected to lack of knowing each other. And we see it also the responsibility from the other hand that we see in Israel, and this is a fact, and it's a sad fact, that the vast majority of those who visit Israel, and I know there are a lot of programs of the Reform movement and conservative, but those who visit every year a few times to Israel are mostly the conservatives. The conservative, not conservative movement, but the more religious Orthodox ones. Or ultra and modern, and you introduced me as in the King David, and this is true. When I worked in the King David, I had the knowledge. I lived in Madison for a year. I worked with America on programs before. I knew the diversity of the American Jewish community. The majority are Reform, then conservative, then Orthodox. But my friends who were just finished the army and worked there as bellboys or reception, they said to me, all the Jews of America are religious, are Republican, and are rich. Now, this is true because this is the people we saw every year. Sukkot, Pesach, everywhere. In Jerusalem, you walk. These are the Jews you see. And the amount of people, if you look at the amount of Americans who consider themselves Reformed Jews, amount of times they culminated altogether came to Israel, as opposed to the modern Orthodox, much less. So the interaction that the Israelis have are much less. And because of that, when you don't know the other, you can't assume, you just hear what you read in the news. And then you hear the ultra-Orthodox party saying reforms are the goyim. It makes it challenging. And I'm saying again, it's a personal thing for me also, because my wife passed that. My wife is written as a Jew in the interior ministry, or not to that's Zehut. She's written Jewish, my daughter is written Jewish, but when she'll want to marry at 18, she will not be able to, as long as the situation continues. She'll need to get married abroad. If it's a good thing, no, it's not. The thing is, how do you change it? How does one change it? In a way, you need to be very, very sophisticated, very, very understanding the political ways and sensitivities of Israeli society. It will not happen like that, but there are a lot of changes on the ground in Israel. A lot of change, and just the last word about that. 30 years ago, she would not be written, even 10 years ago, she would not have been written Jewish in the ID. She is now. You could not do a reform conversion in Israel in any circumstances. You can today. You acknowledge when you marry abroad, a lot of things are changing in the secular versus religion and reform, very, very slowly, but it's changing. Please.
I just had a thought.
Just your name?
My name is Alan Turuva.
Alan, right.
I'm a member here. And the thought that I had is that we have really been doing something wrong here in this country and in Israel in our identification. I think what we've done to cause this discourse, the words flow, I am a Reformed Jew, I am an Orthodox Jew, I am a conservative Jew, I am a secular Jew. We should be saying, I am a Jew Reform, I am a Jew conservative, I am a Jew Orthodox. The thought should be, what we should really have in our mind is that, number one, I am a Jew. And then secondly, we have another organization that we kind of adhere to, or we lean toward. I think of myself first and foremost as a Jew, not a Reformed Jew, a Jew. So that's just a thought.
No, thank you for the thought, Alan, but I agree with you. I really think the fact we're sitting today here, I don't know how many of you, I'm not asking because it's a personal thing, how many consider yourself practicing religious Reform Jews? How many consider yourself just Reform Jews? How many consider yourself Jewish Reform, as you say? I really don't know. But I know my friends don't deal with these questions in Israel. They don't deal with identity issues as much as we deal with them with when I've been on Birthright 4 times escorting groups in a summer camp in Canada. I think 80% of the discussions are identity. What are you more? Are you Reform Jew? Are you Jew? Are you Jew Reform? Are you American Jew? Are you Israeli Jew? Are you a Jew of the world? Are you Universalist? Are you a particularist? What are you? Israelis don't ask themselves what they are. They're just Israelis. And the very interesting fact, and this is, I think, always when I tell people, they're pretty surprised. They asked Israelis, secular Israelis, what are you more? Or not only secular, in general. Are you more Jewish first or are you Israeli first? Those who said they are Jews first voted to the right, which surprises many. Those who said they're Israeli first voted left, which is completely different than what you would think in other places. Here you say, I'm a Jew, so it means that it's part of your other part of your identity. In Israel, those who are just living their life, there aren't a lot of contradictions and discussions about the place of religion and state in Israel, of the dominance of the rabbinical institutions and about oppressiveness sometimes of the religious institutions. Those are a lot of discussions, but it's not an identity discussion. It's a practical, political, institutional discussion. And therefore, it's also a problem that when one side talks about identity, the other side is confident in their identity, then comes a clash, because you are still in the debates about that. And if the Israelis would have understood that the Reformed Jews are, we're not that far away. It's the same thing, most of the things. So you're practicing, they're singing Hebrew songs, There are people who don't know that there are Israeli flags in Reform synagogues in America. They don't know that. I'm not joking. This is really, they don't know. They don't know that the Reforms are Jews. And I don't know, did any one of you see the Israeli show, The New Jew? Highly recommended. We just brought the main actor and the producer to an event at the Consul General's residence. This is a program that was now, it was just published in Israeli TV, in the national, it's like our PBS, and it's in Hebrew. There are 4 episodes. Then the most known comedian in Israel, Guri Alfi, goes to discover the new Jews in America. For us, they're not new, and for you, they're not new. It's you, but they are. But for Israelis, it was new. It's the first time in primetime Israeli television. There were more than 800,000 views, which is for America, it's nothing. But for Israel, there are 9 million people, including children. So 800,000 people, and it was published all over the press. There are those who hated it, those who loved it, but it really shows in a very positive way the news. So they went to meet the half Korean, the rabbi in New York in the synagogue, in the Central Synagogue, I think, yeah. So, and many different groups of the Jews of color, and to meet the conservatives and the LGBTQ Jewish communities and more, how to find their Jewish identity. And it was received very positively in Israel, but it's the first time in 20 years that there was something showed about American Jews for Israelis. And I say, we need to have a birthright of Israelis coming also to America to meet the American Jews. Not everything is one-sided, but Israelis, besides the shlichim of the Jewish agency or some diplomats who know, that's it. How many people are exposed to the American Jews? No one. So I really think these things are beneficial to this understanding.
So I want to push just a little bit on what you said about the women of the wall and what happens in Jerusalem, because I think Jerusalem, my experience living there and being there, is that Jerusalem is not Israel, right? It really doesn't reflect the diversity in ways that Haifa does, or Tel Aviv, or down south, further south in Beersheba and even further. And I think that, having an experience at the King David Hotel and who you're seeing at the King David Hotel, you can't just, extrapolate from that. This is what the world looks like. And I think also with the women of the wall, because people are beating each other up and getting arrested, that gets on the news, right? All the work that was done to change rules about conversion in Israel, all of the civil rights actions where people are not getting beat up and not getting arrested, doesn't make the news. And so I think that there's more that needs to be done. And it's the same thing here. I mean, I'm not blaming it on the Israeli press. It's the same thing here. When people get beat up and arrested, that makes the news. And the warm fuzzy stories and the victories don't always make the news. And so I think that there's and so you started to address it a little bit with having Israelis come here. And I think that that's really going to make the difference, because for Americans and for American Jews, they're looking at Israel and they're seeing that same black and white picture, and imagining that everybody in Israel just wants to build settlements in the West Bank and to continue to expand and to heck with everything else, and so it doesn't. I think it's. I think that it's what I heard you, and maybe I heard this incorrectly, is placing the blame on the reform movement in Israel for the negative view that Israelis have of the reform movement, and I don't think that's fair. And just as you want to say there's a different government and we have to look at the government differently, but the truth of the matter is the government is not just the coalition. The government is 120 members of Knesset, and in that 120 members of Knesset, there are people who want to continue to push settlements, who continue to want to delegitimize anything other than ultra-Orthodox Judaism. And so I think it's much more complex than that. And so and Netanyahu is still a force, just as Trump is still a force, even though they're not in office. And that has an impact. And so I think that there's there's so much more that needs to be done in making the connection from Israel to the diaspora. And I don't feel like in terms of actions that Israel cares about the diaspora. And I think that's fundamentally what needs to be shifted in the mindset that for JUF to say, we're more concerned about our donors than we are about Israel.
Yeah.
It says something about there's less of that care and concern coming through. And it's not just about the reduction in existential threats. It's that feeling that Israel doesn't really care about us. And so why should we care about Israel?
Thank you for the open and honest comments. I will start by saying, if you understood that, then I didn't convey the message in the right way, because that's not what the aim was. The aim was to get away from the blame game. And I did not put the responsibility on the reform movement. I was giving an example of how the Israeli, and we have to speak honestly, because if we'll speak in a diplomatic manner on that, saying everyone is doing a fantastic job, it's not the reality. The reality of Israelis, and this is the brutal truth, Israelis don't know the reform movement, they don't know the actions, they don't understand the importance of the diaspora Jews, as you mentioned, and what they see is what they read in the press. If it's good and if it's bad, it's the fact. And the fact is that if you look at things that are connected to the reform movement, you'd see the women of the wall. Now, again, I did not say what I think about the women of the wall. I think they're also doing a lot of very courageous things there. I'm just putting that aside. I'm just saying that this is one example of what Israelis mostly see that are connected, and it's not something that they feel like they concerns to them. And I think we need to change this equation. And changing this equation that's why I also suggested sending Israelis here, in order exactly to understand this is a two-way direction. When I'm in Israel, I preach to exactly the other things, to say to them, you have to know more about our brothers and sisters in America, to understand how important and vital it is for the existence of the state of Israel, to build strong, profound relationship with the reform and conservative movement, who are the dominant movement in the United States and will remain. Even if people are saying they're shrinking, doesn't matter, they'll remain strong, and I believe they're getting stronger and stronger because of the inclusiveness of the reform movement here. That you're not saying if there are mixed marriages, okay, thank you, but you're welcome to join, and their kids feel like they're at home. It's a beautiful thing. And I think that Israelis don't know that enough. And that's why things like the program that was just now published and other actions that we hear from this government, and you're right that there are elected officials, 120 are representative, but there is a difference between the executive branch, which are still the government and coalition, rather than the ones. So if we are looking in America, it's a different system. But in Israel, those who are at power are those who can decide the things. Now, of course, there are other considerations. And there are those who are more extremists in the parliament. That's true. There are those who see the reforms as non-Jews there. There are those who claim that only Orthodoxy needs to rule the Judaism. There are members of the Shas party, maybe, the Yadut HaTorah. Doesn't matter, but there are those there. Currently, they're not at power. They might be in a year, they might be in 4 years. I'm not saying they will not. And they're still a very powerful force in Israeli politics. And there isn't a contra force, I would say, that is fully engaged to change relationship between state and church, so-called, and synagogue, or bringing back the Jews. There is not a party that deals with the diaspora Jews. There are elements inside the parties who are pushing for that. The Labor Party has a lot. In Yesh Atid, there are a lot. And they're all in the Meretz Party. They are there. There are voices that are saying that. And I think that we need to less look at the blame game, because everyone is at fault. Israel is at fault, and I also think American Jews are at fault. I think both sides have responsibility. And it doesn't matter who has the responsibility, it matters what's happening next. And what do we do to change this equation and make this dialogue an open, honest conversation between the younger ones, the older ones, doesn't matter, to see, know each other, understand what bothers the other side, understand what is now the reason why Israel doesn't change X, Y, Z that we think are the right things to change, and Israelis to understand why it's so important for American Jews X, Y, Z. We have to make these conversations happening. And just the last comment for the Jerusalem, it's true Jerusalem doesn't reflect the demography of Israel, but I claim, and I wrote a paper about it in my university, that Jerusalem is the microcosm of Israel, and what's happening to Jerusalem will happen in 10 years, 15 will be the whole country, if we like it, and if we don't, demography is going that way. So a lot of the population are Arab, a lot of the population are ultra-Orthodox. It's the poorest city in Israel, and there's a small secular minority, but there are also very interesting and dynamic things happening. So it's true that it doesn't reflect currently the demography, but it's still the example of what's happening in Jerusalem is really the essence, and it will reflect what's happening. That's what I think will happen.
So
Please.
let me just get to Ryan first and then Ellen. Okay, so Ryan?
Sorry, am I heard?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. I guess I just wanted to talk about, like, I'm not maybe typical of American Jews. I am an Israeli citizen. I lived in Israel for 5 years. I served in the army for a few. But living, here now, it helps to bring a different perspective on what happens there and how Jews here and Jews there are tied in. I mean, when I lived in Israel, being Jewish was not really an issue in part of identity because it was assumed that you are Jewish. Unless it's obvious that you're not, that's the assumption. And it's more, your identity is more, well, are you, is your family a Moroccan family? Is your family an Ashkenazi family? Are they Russian? Are they Iraqi? Et cetera. And that's, I think, something that we sometimes, it's sometimes hard to see that in America because if you're Jewish in America, being Jewish is almost like the first part of your identity, as somebody in the room pointed out earlier. I guess the other thing I wanted to mention, and this kind of harkens back to something you were saying earlier about bridging that divide between Americans today, especially young Americans today, and Israel is, and not to make it too political, but whether you're politically on the left or on the right here or there, I think it's fairly obvious these days that a big part of politics is talking about what's the differences are between liberals and conservatives. I don't want to use the term left or right, but we'll talk liberal and conservative political thought, and it becomes more tribal. And I truly believe that Netanyahu made a very big mistake in tying himself so closely to Trump. And that, I think, in America, even though in Israel, a lot of Jews in Israel that I know that I still speak to were very happy with what Trump did for Israel. A lot of American Jews did not support Trump and are very, I think Jews were one of the most heaviest Democratic voting constituencies in America from the poll numbers that I've seen. And if the goal for Israelis is to kind of reforge or re-strengthen those bonds between Israel and young Jews today, the most important thing, and maybe the easiest thing they could do, is to separate the political parties from the from support and from how those ties are worked out. I'm not sure how it's done easy. I don't have a golden solution, but by continuing to tie things to political parties, and we have to remember that Israeli politics are much different than American politics. Right? American politics have 2 parties, and that's pretty much it. And in Israeli politics, as I know you know, there's 1,000 parties, and some of them are big and some of them are small, and the big players change every few years, and it's not the same. And to tie any one politician there with any one politician or political movement here can only lead to divisiveness and will not bring about that reforging of bonds between Jewish youth today and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I agree with you. I think that the relationship, one has to separate between the political and one has to stay. Our job here is to keep the bipartisanship the most important pillar that we have. And we are meeting, I think 90% of our time, we are trying to meet with people. We are not trying to convince the choir and to preach to the choir. We are trying to talk to those who we would disagree with and try also to show what we can do together. What are the things we can do together and not what are the things that separate us. So we are trying to engage really with those who see, and I agree to a lot of the criticism that people say that, sometimes you're affiliated with one side, you don't want to be affiliated with one side. And I think that the political a lot of the criticism that Israel gets today is connected to what you said before. If it's right or not, I don't know, but it is. We hear it quite often that people say, you, Netanyahu and Trump were the best friends, therefore Israel and the Republicans are best friends, therefore the Democrats you marginalized, and I hear that quite often. And I think we also have responsibility to that. Nevertheless, we have to make sure it's our responsibility on the daily level to make sure we are not a bipartisan matter. And we are really not, and we shouldn't be part of it, and we should continue to work very strongly with our allies here. And it's also important to say that you can still disagree with a certain leader, disagree with Netanyahu or disagree with Trump, you can still like the United States of America and can still be supportive of Israel without being supportive of a certain policy or leader. And I think sometimes we mix those things up. Please.
If I understood.
What's your name?
I'm Alan Tobin.
Alan, another Alan.
Three.
There's three Alans.
Yeah.
Oh,
Three Alans.
okay,
They
we're
all
breaking
ask
the
questions.
statistics.
If you're not an Allen, you're out of here.
Yeah, and they all ask questions.
Yeah, good.
I believe you said that the relationship is important between Israel and the United States, to both Israel and the United States. But do you separate that importance as to, or why there's an importance to the United States or to Israel from the liberal, the reformed Jewish community in the United States to Israel, or Israel's relationship to them? Are there different reasons why that's a necessary relationship?
Just to understand if I understand the question correctly, so you're asking should there be different guidelines to building relationship with the reform movement rather than in general the Jews in America?
Do you view a difference or a difference in the importance of that relationship
Oh,
of
I
the
understand.
Jewish and especially the more liberal Jewish community in the United States between Israel and them?
Yeah, so I understood the question. So I think the answer is yes. And the more we engage in conversation today, the people we need to engage in conversation are the liberal progressive audience. Very clear. That's the situation today. I don't know if tomorrow it's going to change and we'll need to reach out to the conservative. Today, we are trying to reach out as much as we can to the liberal progressive audience to engage in dialogue. And I think the key also, so being close to the reform movement, to the congregants of the reform movement, who most of them consider themselves liberal and progressive, is also a key to the general liberal and progressive mindset in America. And I'll just give you a few examples of the thing we do at the Consulate. So we are responsible for 9 states in the Midwest, and we are part of our priorities really reaching out to the African American community, to the Latin American community, and the liberal and progressives. Those are the 3 elements that we are trying to emphasize. We have a small staff, but very passionate. And for instance, now we initiated the first time, after we visited there and we saw also the post-George Floyd discourse in Minnesota, for instance, which led to there are other parts of America, but they're about equity, equality, about racial issues, about things that are usually not affiliated with Israel, or they put Israel in the bad side of that, in the negative side. We said we are going to the other direction. We initiated the social impact grants in Minnesota, offering individuals and groups from these liberal progressive communities to give them up to $5,000 for any activity they do with their local community, if it's connected to education, healthcare access, equality, food security, environment, women's empowerment, LGBT, doesn't matter what, all these things, which are the essence of the progressive movement, and we are supporting them. Tomorrow we are closing the deadline. The deadline is tomorrow. We got 67 organizations and individuals, mostly from the African American community, applied. This is huge, 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 huge. This is one example. Another thing we're doing is we are working now on Thursday, we have an opening of a new program, New Life. They work in the little village with the Hispanic community, with gangs and violence, gun violence, bringing the Israeli organization Natal to give them training about post-traumatic ways of dealing, training the trainers. We did that in Bronzeville with the Pastor Harris, the African-American community. Now we're expanding it there. We are doing another one in Detroit. We are doing with the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, a competition for young Hispanic entrepreneurs. We're working with them. So I think that this is part of what we're doing. Instead of just talking and telling, yeah, Israel supports liberal values, we're showing it on the ground, we're supporting it financially, and we're finding partners who believe in that, and we're showing that Israel wants to improve and help and assist on these implementation on the ground.
If I'm hearing again what you're saying, it's not resonating real well with me from the side, if I'm playing the devil's advocate for that. That it sounds like you're more interested in getting support of anyone that you can from the United States because of what Israel can gain from a relationship with the government of the United States, than really being concerned with a relationship with the liberal Jews in the United States. It doesn't sound like, other than you, that perhaps there's a lot of people in Israel that are supporting what you're saying at times.
No, so look, I would say again, coming back to the government. The first speech that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister gave was about the importance of strengthening the relationship with the Reform and Conservative movement in America. This was never said so clearly, but so high officials in Israel. And the Minister of Diaspora, who is going all over the American Jewish communities here, Nachman Shai, he talks about it, he gives budgets for programs within the American progressive Jews to strengthen this relationship. This is something that it's in the essence and understanding that's why I'm here today on a Sunday morning. You know, you're asking, but I'm here sent not as Daniel Aschheim or as Rini Schreiber, but as the government of Israel's representative. And I'm also reporting back to Israel things that are coming from these conversations. It doesn't stop by me sitting here and listening to you. In the end of these things, I report back and they all read it. I know that they read it because we had visits from very high-level officials who came and said, we read about what these groups said, and we were very curious, how do you reach out to them more? So the fact that I'm here today speaking to you is really part of the sign that this is important for us. I could have done other things, but I think this is very, very important to be here today. And you could have also done other things. So it means that you care. You came on your Sunday morning in not such a beautiful weather day to come and listen to me. And you were sitting in your homes in the Zoom, and also you could have done other things. And therefore, I think this is an important, and the Consul General goes to all the communities in Yom Kippur, spoke to in Temple Israel, and he spoke to other ones. I'm going next Friday, I'm going to be in Sinai, giving a talk about it. We are there. We are trying to be everywhere we can. In summer camps, we couldn't because of COVID, but with youth group, with university, with the Hillels, we are trying to be everywhere we can. We just hosted now the first time the Young Diplomat Fellowship. And we brought 20 young leaders from around the Midwest, student leaders, who were not affiliated with Israel, but are all considered themselves liberal and progressive. Half of them were Jewish, half of them were not. And we brought them to a 3-day intensive seminar. We didn't do another Hasbara training. We did a workshop with a lot of questions, a lot of answers, but a lot of hands-on experiences. We did simulations, how to tackle issues, dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, moral dilemmas. In internet, we did Model UN, and they are going to implement projects with their community. So the Jews of them were very eager to hear, how do we relate to these liberal progressive Jews and how do we work together with them? So we are trying really to do outreach because we really value you. And we know how important it is, the relationship with you and your younger ones and your older ones, doesn't matter what, it's critical for the future. And I said it in the beginning, I'm going to reiterate that. The future of Israel relies on its relationship with the diaspora Jews. And I also believe that the diaspora Jews' relationship with Israel is critical for the continuation of the diaspora Jews. So I think it's really mutual. It's a win-win-win-win-win. Everyone needs each other. And as long as we understand that and we continue to talk about it, we'll be in a better stage. I don't know, you tell me the time. I'm fine. I have another one, but I'm flexible.
So let's take about 5 more minutes.
Okay.
And
The next one is at 11?
The next one's at
Okay.
11, so it'll be in the same room.
No problem. I can do more if you want. Doesn't matter. I don't need a 5-minute break.
Is that your water bottle?
Okay.
So if you're, doesn't matter for me.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Wait.
Yeah, just
Sure, yeah.
Go ahead.
kind of off on a different.
Your name?
Ellen Tobin.
Alan and Ellen, God, Paul, you planned this.
Wanted to make it easy.
I don't want to hear, yeah. So
Wanted to make it easy. I'm
Selected
changing my name to Ellen as well.
Okay.
So,
You know, we thought when we had our daughter Ella, her name is Ella, we thought we had such a unique name. We came to the hospital, Sharet Tzedek, and my wife said The midwife asked, so what's her name? We said, Ella, she's probably, said, yeah, she's the fourth I had the last hour. Yes, please.
Okay, my question is a little bit off color, I think. But when we're talking about the Reformed and conservative movement opposed to the Orthodox, the one thing that I'm not hearing you talk about at all is the Palestinians.
Mhm.
And I know that there's some people that I have talked with who question what is happening within Israel with the Palestinians. And you hear, the only thing that we hear are bits and pieces, that they're, given a certain area to live in, and yet they're not helping them to become more I don't want to say secular, but just having a better life, supposedly. So where is the Reformed conservative movement opposed to that Orthodox movement in that position?
So I think, first of all, the Palestinian issue is an important issue. The fact that I didn't speak about it today is not because it's not important. It's just the fact is that the government that we have today is just decided that they can't decide on the real future of what could be the solution, whether it's 2-state, 1-state, 3-state, 4-state confederation. I used to think that the 2-state is the only way. I'm not sure anymore what's feasible on the ground, but that's for another discussion. But they decided on a practical level, because there's the ultra-right, the ultra-left, the center, that they will improve the lives on the ground of the Palestinians as long as they can, as much as they can, improve more mutual projects in healthcare, economy, giving more workers entrance, and it's happening on the ground. We saw there were meetings with Mahmoud Abbas after years of no meetings, and these things are discussed. Nevertheless, it will not, most probably will not be a solution in this framework in the next few years. Doesn't mean that there are no improvements that could be and should be made on the ground. And also, if we don't discuss it, doesn't mean it's going to disappear. This is something that we need to solve in some way or the other. And when it's going to happen, what way, I don't know. I think also the Palestinian leadership is not, the current Palestinian leadership is not ready for real change. Also, I think we are going to wait for a generational change there. I believe that it's going to make difference. Nevertheless, it does need to be solved. And as you're saying also, if you're talking about, if I understood you correctly, about how are the American Reform and Conservatives and versus the Orthodox seeing the solution, or the Israeli ones? What was the?
Yeah, kind of which way, how do they all view it? I guess the reason I'm asking is there's a lot written about on the college campuses, and you were bringing
True,
that up.
yeah.
There's issues with, kids saying, well, if you aren't pro-Palestinian and you're a Jew, and you believe people should be persecuted, so there's this kind of stuff that's also out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of out there, and a lot of fake news, a lot of things which are based on certain things. The thing is, most people hear sound bites. In the Gaza operation in May, I was invited, I was speaking 53 news outlets in the Midwest. I was interviewed approximately 15 to 20 minutes each time. How long do you think, Ellen, I got? It was published, each clip. Between 2 to 7 seconds, that was the average. Now, you explained the complexities, the willingness for peace, the explanation about the challenges, the different opportunities, and then you get something that the editor wanted to be in light with the other parts of the article that you don't even know what they were. So you get a quote based on what they wanted you to quote, and then the complexity goes away. And the other side uses sound bites. Apartheid, 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 colonialism, colonialism, colonialism. So you throw it out there and it becomes the truth. And you repeat it again, and what can I start doing? So Israel is not, I need to explain why Israel is not an apartheid state. You need to start apartheid. You know what's apartheid. My father was born and raised in apartheid South Africa. I heard what's apartheid. The 95% of those who say apartheid, I don't know what they refer to. And colonialism, they use, a lot of the problem is that the discourse that is used to impose it on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is taken from racial and colonialist history that is learned here, and they're using the copy-paste. So if the African Americans here were deprived and were discriminated, we are taking it and putting it to the indigenous community of the Arabs in Israel. And the Jews are forgotten as indigenous people there. And the discourse becomes a discourse which is just not accurate. So taking the terminology, and this is done not by accident, this is done by a very good job. The so-called pro-Palestinian organizations, I think they're anti-Palestinians, because they won in American campuses, they didn't improve an inch the life of the poor Palestinians on the ground. So I don't know how pro-Palestinian they are. They're mostly anti-Israel than pro-Palestinian. But there we're trying to bring the terminology used here to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has nothing to do with each other. This is a conflict with a lot of terminology, has nothing to do the relationship between the white supremacists and the African Americans or the Native Americans. Just nonsense.
So Jerry and then Gil.
You talk about the relationship with the progressive reform movement and everything that's being done here, which I'm really glad to hear about. But I'm also very concerned about what's happening in Israel with it. So that, when I see my daughter who lives there and her friends, she can't get married there.
Yeah.
Okay. My rabbi cannot practice that. So it's one thing to say, yes, we're doing that and make all these outreach efforts here, but what's happening in Israel to get equality for reforms and progressives, both in recognition and funding?
Yeah, you're right. It's an issue. It's an issue, and I mentioned it before. It's about my family. It's a personal issue. And it's an issue that needs to be held and needs to be changed. And I think there is progress. It's very, very difficult because the way the history and the institutional way that Israel was founded, and it might be a historical mistake, it might be a good, depending on which view you come. The Orthodox will say it was right, that Ben-Gurion started it then with giving the Orthodox monopoly on the rabbinical institutions, and it just became stronger with the years, and it becomes institutions, and institutions, and this can only change within the political framework. So the civil society, which Rini is now director of civil society, the civil society in Israel really got a lot of successes in this field, better today than it was 20 years ago for sure, but it came from civil society, it's from bottom up. The real dramatic change can come only from the political level. We are seeing differences now in the discourse in the Yemina party, which is the Naftali Bennett's party. The Minister of Religious Affairs, Matan Kahana, is proposing a few different reforms which are bashed by the ultra-Orthodox party, saying you are breaking Judaism and it's going. I'll tell them to you, you'll say that's not a real reform. It's a minor step towards other things, and it still doesn't have anything to do with the reformer conservatives. They're talking about reforms in the conversion, reforms in kashrut, reforms to doing the Kotel compromise, the Western Wall compromise, which has to do with the reform and liberal and conservatives. The rest does not. The other ones are to make it, I would say, from the ultra-Orthodox to make it modern Orthodox, which is still a step towards when you are in a hegemony that is so dominant. And one needs to remember, it's not only a decision like that. We're talking about thousands of workers in these things, in the kashrut, the rabbinical forces, budgets allocated. So slowly but surely, I believe that there will be changes. This government, another government, but it is moving towards more plurality and more openness towards them. It's very, very slow, you're right. And this is something not in our hands as a foreign ministry, but we are recommending as a foreign ministry always doing these steps. And it needs to be in a political constellation and understanding of all parties. It can be done, it will be done, and will be implemented. There are forces inside the Israel Beitenu party, Meretz party, Labour party, are clearly saying we need to do a reform to bring in the reforms and conservative to give them the authority. They are, but they are not alone in coalition.
So Gil, you had, or Harriet?
It's Harriet, yes. My question is, in all of these discussions with the youngest generation, what is it that we're talking with them about why Israel is important to us as American Jews? In other words, it seems to me that there may be many Jewish children who don't even understand why they should care about Israel versus Spain or Italy or another country. What part of the discussion helps them to understand why we as American Jews should be concerned about Israel?
Fantastic question. If I would have known the answer, I'd be very rich today. I would be an advisor to all the organizations that are trying to find the answer to that question. And I'm saying it because this is something that I hear every single time. The question is, how do we teach the children? Because I hear a lot of times people are saying, you lied to us all these years, You told us Israel is perfect. Then we came to college. We realized there's occupation, there are Palestinians, blah, the next, all the things that are coming. Nevertheless, the question is, before you're teaching the critical perspectives and the different approaches, one needs to assume that Israel is important and is in their heart. I do not believe the ones who claim that we need to teach the complexities before we teach why it's important. Because if you're teaching the complexities, it's in a too early stage. The first stage is not understood. And I think it needs to come, and this is something that I think your movement needs to discuss amongst yourself. It's less me to tell you, but it's why Israel is important. Whether Israel is important on a religious basis, on a cultural basis, on a communal basis, on a social basis, on a people-to-people basis, on a diplomatic basis, all of the above, and how to engage each one of them. Because the one thing, and I said it before, we cannot assume that the younger generation cares about it like we care about it. We just can't assume that. Saying that, we need to see how do we engage with the children. And maybe singing Avenu Shalom Aleichem and telling them hummus is great. And maybe Idan Reichel is great to bring them from Israeli music. And maybe it's not enough. Maybe it's not enough because they hear Idan Reichel Israeli hummus, but again, they ate great tapas in Spain and learned the Spanish language. And they like it more than their Sunday school every Sunday morning. So we need to think, what can we bring added value, which is important? And I think the Orthodox way said for us, it's a very simple answer. Why is the Bible? The religious aspect, no discussion. But in the Reform movement, when there are discussions, are we cultural Jews? Are we a nation Jews? What is Jewishness for me? Halakha may be a part of it, but not all. And then Israel needs to come into this discourse. And I think there are a lot of congregations that are trying different methods. Some are more successful, some are not. But a lot of the Reform kids are still feeling very connected to Israel. So some did a fantastic job, some feel less. So I think we need to find it together, seeing what talks to the community more, what they feel more connected to, and how to bring the real, true Israel. And the most important, I would think, meet Israelis, meeting people. Talking about people is different than meeting people. The more we meet in Israel or here, the more the chance they will care. And if there's a war in Gaza, they will phone their friend and ask them, how are you today? Rather than read the news and seeing statistically X amount of rockets fell in Tel Aviv doesn't mean a thing. It does not. When we know, it's like the army. When we know someone in the army, we shake when things are happening. When we read statistics about what happens in the army, it doesn't interest me. Interest on the intellectual level. We want the personal, emotional level to be involved.
So,
Thank you.
I really appreciate everything you're saying. And I think that we're probably all kind of hooked into what's going on. I think we as American Jews, Jewish Americans, really need to be very cautious of how we handle our feelings about what Israel isn't doing right, because I don't feel that we're doing a great job here. And I think that the education of our children is a top-down type of thing. It comes not just from the leaders in our community, but from the parents who are very often totally not involved in Judaism, and yet they send their children to Hebrew school. And, I think they somehow think that by just ingesting a Sunday school hour, 2 hour, whatever program, it's going to do whatever they're not doing. So I think that the parents need to be much more involved and much more concerned, because otherwise it kind of fades away with every generation. And that's a huge concern. So we here in this country have a lot to do. And when it comes to misrepresenting Israel, fortunately, we do have some very strong organizations like CAMERA, which is a committee for honest reporting in the Mideast. I think there's not enough support of these organizations. because it's just not important to a lot of Jews. And that's very disturbing because we can't let it just slide.
It's interesting what you're saying, because first, a lot of the thing with the organizations that it becomes a political thing, and then people say, I don't feel comfortable with camera because they are showing it's too right wing for me, or this is too left for me. So that is for that. But I think your first comments, what you talked about, what can build in the education part of sending to Sunday school or not, I actually think that Israel is an amazing opportunity also for the Reform and Conservative movement to have something to bring the people together on the part of the cultural Judaism point of view. Because if the halacha is less of an interest for the young community, who I'm assuming a lot are less caring about, we can use Israel in a positive manner to make it the fun thing that surrounds us. Because I see it with my family in LA. I have three of my cousins live there. They're all South African Jews, came Zionist movements, came there. One of them, it was the president of one of the most important Reform synagogues there in LA, one of the wealthiest and the most important ones. And I had conversations with her because her children are my age. So my cousin's children are my age. We're one generation back. And she really cares. She cares about Israel. Nevertheless, her kids were in Israel once, twice, but it's exactly my example. They went to Spain, they fell in love with Spain. Mm-hmm. Israel does not play any role in their life whatsoever, nothing. So they did the Sunday school in the shul. They went to Jewish school, now they went to universities, they're working in non-Jewish, none of them work in the Jewish world. Some of them did an intermarriage. None of them are considering going to shul actively anymore. They say they will send their children to Sunday school when they're growing up. Will that keep them? I'm not sure, because they will not have what my cousin has, still the love that she gave them. But their children are going because their parents told them go to Sunday school to make a good feeling for themselves that they still did it. And I really had profound conversations with them. They like Israel because they have family in Israel. That is it. We are there, so that's their connection to Israel. If we were not there, they would not care at all about Israel. And their friends and their friends' friends, I've spoken to them, and it's very, very similar. So I think if we do find a way of doing it and making this connection a fun, engaging conversation, not only talking about the problems or the challenges, making it fun, first of all, and caring, then we can continue also working on what is Jewishness for us in regards to Israel. Is Israel part of our Jewish identity? Or is it also one pillar? Is Tikkun Olam a value that's more important, less important than Israel? Is it parallel? Can it be combined, social activism and Israel? Does it need to be separate? And that brings me to the example I gave you. Why are we doing the social impact grants? We also want to show that American Jews, you don't need to separate. We are giving Jewish Hillel organizations, we are saying, we are going to fund your programs in the social activism branch and not the Israel branch. We don't want to be speaking to the Israel committee. We want to speak to the social engagement committee and support there. And that's the aim. If we connect Israel, social activism, Tikkun Olam together, and not always Israel committee, social activism committee, that's the key, I think, to success.
So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank
We have another group coming in 6 minutes, and I want to give you time for a little bio break as well.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your.
Thank
for
you
making
very
your-
much.
Thank you. And for doing, which is really important work. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you,
coming
thank
and
you.
for your very interesting and engaging questions. Really. Thank you.
Okay, so.
So I'm going to go to the restroom and come back.
You know where it is?
I know, yeah,
Okay.
I already spent time there.
I get lost in this building, I will tell you that.
It's here on the left, right? I think so.